December 19, 1944. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles, France. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in a room thick with cigarette smoke and tension, surrounded by maps showing a nightmare unfolding in the Ardennes forest. The German offensive had punched a bulge 50 mi deep into Allied lines. 3 American divisions were shattered. Bastogne was about to be encircled, and the Supreme Commander needed a miracle. The emergency conference had pulled together every senior Allied commander who could make it. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, Air Marshal Arthur Tadar. They were discussing options, timelines, possibilities, most of them grim. The general consensus, any counterattack would take weeks to organize, maybe a month. The Germans had achieved complete tactical surprise, and the Allies were reeling. Then the door opened. A figure strode in unannounced, cavalry boots gleaming, ivory-handled revolvers at his hips, face weather-beaten from the cold. He hadn't called ahead, hadn't requested permission. He'd simply jumped in his Jeep at his 3rd Army headquarters, 175 mi away, and driven through the night to get here. Eisenhower looked up from the maps. His expression, caught by several witnesses in the room, shifted from surprise to something between exasperation and relief. He shook his head slowly, and according to General Omar Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story, Eisenhower said with a mixture of frustration and admiration, "God, this is Patton." George S. Patton Jr. had arrived, and he was about to make a promise so audacious that half the room thought he'd lost his mind. If you want to discover more untold stories from history's greatest military minds, subscribe now so you never miss a new video and drop a comment below. What fascinates you most about Patton's command style, or simply let us know where you're watching from. To understand why Patton's unannounced appearance carried such weight and why it both infuriated and inspired Eisenhower, you need to understand what was happening in those desperate December days. 4 days earlier, on December 6, 1944, Hitler had launched Operation Wach Amin Watch on the Rhine. It was his last great gamble in the West. 25 divisions, including 9 panzer divisions totaling over 400,000 men, crashed through the thinly held Ardennes sector. The German objective was ambitious to the point of fantasy. Drive to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, encircle and destroy 4 Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace. The initial assault achieved complete surprise. At 5:30 a.m. on the 6th hours, 1/600 German artillery pieces opened fire along an 80-mile front. American units, many green and newly arrived or exhausted and resting after months of combat, were overwhelmed. The 106th Infantry Division, which had been in the line for only 5 days, saw 2 of its regiments, the 4-2 and 4-2 completely surrounded. Within 72 hours, over 8,000 men would surrender, the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater. German panzer columns poured through the gaps. KF Grouper Piper under SS Oberbannführer Joachim Piper drove deep into American rear areas. On December 17th, at Malmedy, his men murdered 84 American prisoners of war in a snowy field, a war crime that would fuel American fury and determination. By December 19th, when Patton walked into Eisenhower's headquarters, the situation was critical. The vital road junction of Bastogne was about to be surrounded. The 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division were racing to defend it, but German forces were converging from 3 sides. If Bastogne fell, the Germans would have a clear corridor to the Meuse River, and the entire Allied position in Belgium could collapse. Eisenhower's staff had been working around the clock. The Supreme Commander himself had slept perhaps 10 hours total in the past 4 days. His Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, later wrote in his diary, "The boss looks 10 years older. This is the worst crisis we've faced since D-Day." The prevailing view among the Allied High Command was cautious. Montgomery, who Eisenhower had just given command of all Allied forces north of the Bulge, was talking about a tidy withdrawal to more defensible lines. Bradley was devastated. This was happening in his 12th Army Group sector, and he took it as a personal failure. The General Staff was discussing how long it would take to shift divisions, reorganize supply lines, and prepare a methodical counterattack. Eisenhower, however, was thinking differently. This wasn't just a crisis, it was an opportunity. The Germans had come out from behind their fortifications. They'd extended their supply lines. Their flanks were vulnerable. If the Allies could hold Bastonia and hit the Germans from the sides, they could trap the entire German offensive force. But who could move fast enough? Who had divisions positioned where they could strike the southern flank? Who had the audacity to attack in the middle of a blizzard with minimal planning time into the teeth of Germany's last great offensive? That's when Patton arrived. The scene in that conference room has been described by multiple witnesses, and while details vary, the essence remains consistent. Patton didn't wait to be briefed. He'd already gotten the intelligence reports. He'd already studied the maps. He'd already done something that no one in that room knew about yet. He'd set his entire Third Army staff to work on contingency plans for exactly this scenario. According to Bradley's account, Patton walked straight to the map, traced his finger along the southern edge of the German penetration, and said, "We can attack on the 22nd. The room went silent. Then several officers began speaking at once, objecting. December 22nd was 3 days away. 3 days. Patton's Third Army was currently engaged in offensive operations 150 mi to the south, attacking toward the Saar River. To disengage from an offensive, wheel 90 degrees north, move 3 full divisions through winter weather on roads clogged with retreating troops and fleeing refugees, and attack into the flank of the most powerful German offensive since 1940, all in 72 hours. It was insane. British Air Marshal Arthur Tadar, who was present, later wrote, "I thought Patton had finally overreached. What he was proposing violated every principle of military logistics." But Eisenhower leaned forward. He knew Patton. He'd worked with him in North Africa, in Sicily, through all the triumphs and disasters of their complicated partnership. He'd covered for Patton after the slapping incidents. He'd sidelined him after Patton's disastrous comments about the Soviets. He'd brought him back because, for all his flaws, George Patton could do things other commanders couldn't imagine. George, Eisenhower said, and this quote is recorded in multiple sources, including Harry C. Butcher's My 3 Years with Eisenhower. "When can you actually attack?" Patton didn't hesitate. "The morning of December 22nd, I'll hit them with 3 divisions. Eisenhower studied him. "That's only the beginning. We need more than a raid. We need sustained offensive pressure all the way to Bastonia and beyond." "I can have 6 divisions in motion within a week," Patton replied, "and I'll keep attacking until we've cut off every German soldier in the Bulge." The room erupted in objections again. A British liaison officer pointed out that Patton's supply lines would be stretched impossibly thin. A logistics officer noted that the roads were already jammed. Bradley himself, Patton's immediate superior and old friend, said quietly, "George, are you sure about this?" Patton turned to him. According to Bradley's memoir, Patton's exact words were, "Brad, this time, the Kraut stuck his head in a meat grinder." He turned back to Eisenhower. "And this time, I've got hold of the handle." What happened next became one of the most famous exchanges of World War II. Eisenhower, still skeptical, asked Patton to be specific. "Exactly how will you do this?" Patton walked to the map and outlined his plan. The Thread Corps under Major General John Milliken would attack with the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division. They would drive north from the Luxembourg border, smash through whatever German forces were on the southern shoulder of the Bulge, and punch through to Bastonia. Following behind, WI Corps and 8 Corps would widen the corridor and continue the offensive. The plan had one massive problem. Patton's forces were currently spread across a 100-mile front, most of them actively engaged with the enemy. To execute this maneuver, Patton would have to disengage 133,078 men from active combat, reorient them 90 degrees to the north, move them an average of 75 mi through winter weather, reorganize their supply lines, conduct reconnaissance of entirely new terrain, and attack a force that had already demonstrated it could shatter American divisions in 72 hours. Eisenhower looked at Patton for a long moment. Then, and this detail appears in multiple accounts, including Eisenhower's own memoir, Crusade in Europe, he asked, "When did you start planning this?" Patton grinned. "December 16th, the day they attacked." It turned out that Patton, with his remarkable military intuition, had anticipated this moment. While other commanders were scrambling to understand what was happening, Patton had already convened his staff. He'd ordered them to prepare 3 separate contingency plans, each one designed for attacking the Bulge from a different angle, depending on how the situation developed. He designated units. He'd alerted supply officers. He'd done everything he could do without actually disobeying his orders to continue the SAR offensive. Eisenhower's operations officer, Lieutenant General Harold Bull, later wrote in his diary, "Patton had been planning this for 3 days, while the rest of us were still figuring out how bad things were. That's why he could make such an audacious promise." He'd already done the impossible part, which was the planning. But planning and executing are two different things. Eisenhower knew that. He also knew that if Patton failed, if his divisions got bogged down, if they couldn't reach Bastonia in time, if the offensive stalled, it could be catastrophic. The Germans might break through to the Meuse. The Allies might be forced into a winter stalemate. The war could be prolonged by months, maybe years. Eisenhower made his decision. "All right, George," he said. According to multiple witnesses, including General Bradley and Eisenhower's naval aide, Harry Butcher, the Supreme Commander stood up and walked around the desk to face Patton directly. "You'll attack on the 22nd. I'm giving you operational control of 3 Corps. You'll coordinate with Middleton at EOD Corps for the Bastonia sector. I want continuous pressure, no stopping, no consolidating. You attack and you keep attacking until we've eliminated this bulge." Then Eisenhower added something that revealed both his trust in Patton and his understanding of what made the man tick. He looked at the assembled officers and said, "Gentlemen, General Patton has just made us a promise that sounds impossible. I've learned something about George over the years." He turned back to Patton. "When something sounds impossible, that's usually when he's most dangerous." The meeting broke up shortly after. As commanders dispersed to their units, Eisenhower kept Patton back for a private word. What they discussed wasn't recorded, but Bradley, who waited outside, later wrote that when Patton emerged, he looked like a man who'd just been given the keys to kingdom come. The moment Patton left that conference room, the impossible became merely improbable. He drove through the night back to his headquarters in Nancy, France, arriving at 2:30 a.m. on December 20th. His staff, who'd been working on the contingency plans around the clock, were waiting. Patton didn't waste time. "We're going," he announced. "Alert all units. We attack on the 22nd. His chief of staff, Brigadier General Hobart Gay, had the orders ready. Within hours, coded messages went out to every division in 3rd Army. What followed was one of the most remarkable movements in military history. Consider the scale. The 4th Armored Division had to move from positions near Saarbrücken to assembly areas in Luxembourg, approximately 150 miles through winter weather, on roads that were already clogged with retreating 1st Army units and Belgian refugees fleeing the German advance. The division had 10,037 men, 27 medium tanks, 77 light tanks, and hundreds of support vehicles. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored, later recalled, "We received the order at 400 hours on December 20th. I looked at the map, looked at the weather report, 12 in of snow expected, and thought, we're going to try something that can't be done." But they did it. The 4th Armored moved out at dawn. Military police set up traffic control points every few miles. Patton himself rode up and down the columns in his Jeep, urging speed. When he encountered a bottleneck, a bridge too narrow, a road blocked by broken-down vehicles, he didn't wait for staff officers to sort it out. He got out of his Jeep and directed traffic himself, a 3-star general playing traffic cop. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored, remembered one encounter with Patton during the move north. "We were stuck behind some supply trucks that had jackknifed on an icy road. I was trying to figure out how to get around them when a Jeep pulled up and Patton jumped out. He didn't ask what the problem was. He walked over to the truck drivers, told them they had 5 minutes to get their vehicles off the road or he'd have tanks push them off. Then he looked at me and said, 'Colonel, every hour you waste here is another American soldier dying in Bastonia. Move.' The trucks were off the road in 3 minutes. The 26th Infantry Division moved from the SAR area to Luxembourg in 48 hours, marching in snow and sleet. The 80th Infantry Division reoriented from attacking east to attacking north and covered nearly 100 miles. All told, 133,108 men, 3,244 tanks and tank destroyers, 11,000 vehicles, and untold tons of supplies moved into position. Colonel Haley Maddox, operations officer for 3 Corps, later wrote, If someone had told me in advance what we were going to do, I would have said it needed at least 10 days. Patton did it in 3. I still don't understand how. The secret was Patton's obsessive focus on tempo. He'd built his entire command philosophy around speed. His units trained for rapid movement. His staff was drilled in quick decision-making. His logistics officers were encouraged to improvise rather than wait for perfect solutions. Now, all that training paid off. But while Patton's divisions were racing north, the situation at Bastonia was deteriorating rapidly. The 101st Airborne, commanded by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had reached the town on December 19th, the same day Patton walked into Eisenhower's conference room. By December 20th, German forces had completely surrounded Bastonia. 7 roads converged on the town, making it a vital communications hub. If it fell, the Germans would have unobstructed access to the Meuse crossings. McAuliffe had about 18,000 men, the 101st Airborne, elements of the 10th Armored Division, and various stragglers and support units that had been swept up in the retreat. They faced at least 45,000 German troops from the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzerlehr Division, and the 26th Vogs Grenadier Division. On December 21st, the day before Patton's attack was scheduled to begin, the German commander sent a delegation under a flag of troops demanding Bastonia's surrender. The written ultimatum concluded, "There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation, that is, the honorable surrender of the encircled town." McAuliffe's one-word reply has become legendary: nuts. The German officers were confused. They didn't understand the American slang. McAuliffe's operations officer had to explain it means go to hell. But bravado aside, Bastonio's situation was critical. Artillery ammunition was running low. Medical supplies were almost exhausted. The weather had been too poor for air ops, and German attacks were intensifying from all sides. At his headquarters in Nancy, Patton was monitoring the situation hour by hour. On the evening of December 21st, he wrote in his diary, later published as the Patton Papers, "We attack in the morning. If we fail, Bastonia falls. If Bastonia falls, the whole front could collapse. Everything depends on the next 48 hours. Either we pull off a miracle, or we hand Hitler his last victory." He also did something that few people knew about at the time. Patton, despite his profane exterior and hell-for-leather image, was deeply religious. That night, he asked his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill, to compose a prayer for good weather. The prayer asked God to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend and grant fair weather for battle. Patton had the prayer printed on cards and distributed to every soldier in 3rd Army. Then he went to sleep for 4 hours, the first real rest he'd had since the crisis began. December 22, 1944, dawned cold and clear. The weather miraculously had broken. After days of snow, fog, and sleet, the sun came out. Allied aircraft could finally fly. Ground conditions were still poor, frozen mud, ice, snow-covered fields, but visibility was good. At 6 a.m., the artillery of 3 Corps opened fire. 300 guns launched a concentrated barrage on German positions along the southern shoulder of the Bulge. At 6:05 a.m., the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry Division, and the 80th Infantry Division attacked north on a 20-meter front. The Germans were caught off guard. They'd been focused on Bastonia, on pushing west, on exploiting their breakthrough. They hadn't expected a major counterattack from the south, certainly not this quickly. The German Xe Panzer Corps, which held the southern flank, had positioned itself for offense, not defense. Still, they fought hard. The 5th Phalam Jagger Division, elite paratroopers, held positions around the town of Bougainville. The 1st SS Panzer Division had elements in the area. These were veteran units, well-equipped and motivated by the initial success of the offensive. The fighting was brutal. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, spearheading the 4th Armored's advance, ran into a German strongpoint at the village of Martelange. German anti-tank guns knocked out 3 Shermans in the first 15 minutes. Abrams radioed back for artillery support, then led his tanks in a flanking maneuver through a forest that wasn't supposed to be passable for armor. They broke through, but it took all day to advance 4 miles. The 26th Infantry Division faced even tougher opposition. They were attacking through the village of Rambush, where German forces had prepared defensive positions. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Mortars had the fields pre-registered. The 104th Infantry Regiment lost 156 men on December 22nd alone, taking casualties at a rate not seen since the Normandy hedge rose. By nightfall of the first day, Patton's forces had advanced only 6 to 8 miles. They were still 35 miles from Bastonia. At this rate, it would take a week to get there. Estonia didn't have a week. At his headquarters, Patton reviewed the situation with his staff. Officers suggested pausing to consolidate, to bring up more supplies, to reorganize the lines. Patton rejected every suggestion. According to General Hobart Gay's notes from that meeting, Patton said, "The Germans expect us to stop. They expect us to be cautious. They expect us to act like we're worried about our flanks and our supply lines. We're not going to stop. We're going to attack all night if we have to. We're going to attack through Christmas if we have to. We're going to break through to Bastonia, because if we don't, those men die, and if they die, Hitler wins." He sent orders to all division commanders. Maintain continuous pressure. Attack through the night. No rest, no pause. When you stop, the enemy recovers. Patton's order read, "Keep them off balance. Keep moving." December 23rd brought better weather and intensified fighting. The Luftwaffe made a rare appearance, and German Fokker-Wulf 120s strafed American columns. Allied P-47, Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs responded. And for the first time since the offensive began, the Allies had air superiority over the battlefield. More importantly, the improved weather allowed C-47 transport planes to fly supply missions to Bastonia. In what was called Operation Repulse, 241 C-47s dropped 144 tons of supplies, ammunition, medical supplies, food into the surrounded town. The paratroopers and tankers of the Bastonia garrison watched the sky fill with parachutes and cheered. They could hold out longer now, but they needed relief soon. Patton's forces continued grinding north. The 4th Armored Division split into 3 combat commands, pushed along multiple axes. Combat Command A under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams fought through Bernin and approached the town of Chaumont. Combat Command B engaged German armor near Warrack. Combat Command R provided flank security. The fighting was savage and personal. Tank DS at ranges of 4C seats WWII. Infantry clearinghouses room by room. Artillery barges that left entire villages as smoking rubble. The 4th Armored lost 39 tanks on December 23rd. They destroyed 55 German tanks and assault guns. But the exchange rate didn't matter. What mattered was forward progress. That night, German forces launched a desperate counterattack against the 4th Armored's positions. The 1st SS Panzer Division threw 2 companies of Panther tanks against the American lines near Bougainville. The attack came at 2000 a.m., with the Germans hoping darkness would negate American artillery superiority. They didn't count on Patton's insistence on aggressive night fighting. American tank destroyers positioned in depth opened fire with their 76mm guns. Artillery forward observers equipped with new proximity fused shells called down devastating defensive fires. The German attack was shattered within an hour, leaving 17 burning Panthers in the snow. Back at Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower was receiving hourly updates. The pressure on him was immense. Montgomery was suggesting that Patton's attack was too hasty, that it would peter out, that the Allies should focus on defending rather than attacking. Churchill was asking questions. Marshall was calling from Washington. Everyone wanted to know, could Patton actually do what he promised? Eisenhower's aide, Harry Butcher, wrote in his diary on December 23rd, "Ike hasn't slept more than 4 hours a night since this started. He's lost weight. He smokes constantly, but he hasn't second-guessed the decision to let Patton attack. He keeps saying, 'George will get there.' He always does." December 24th was Christmas Eve, and the fighting didn't pause. If anything, it intensified. Both sides knew time was running out. For the Germans, the offensive was already failing. They hadn't reached the Meuse. They were running out of fuel. The American fuel dumps they'd planned to capture had been evacuated or destroyed. And now Patton's Third Army was rolling up their southern flank. For the Americans, every hour mattered. Intelligence reports indicated that Bastonia's ammunition stocks were nearly depleted. Medical supplies were gone. Doctors were operating without anesthesia, using bed sheets as bandages. Food was so scarce that the 101st Airborne was eating captured German rations. The 4th Armored Division, now only 12 mi from Bastonia, ran into its toughest opposition yet. The village of Schomen was held by elements of the 5th Balst Division, reinforced by assault guns and positioned behind minefields. The approaches were covered by interlocking fields of fire. It was a perfect defensive position. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams studied the position through binoculars. He could see the church steeple and Schomen, see the German positions, see the minefields. A frontal assault would be suicide. A flanking maneuver would take days they didn't have. Abrams made a decision that would define his career. He ordered his tanks to advance in columns straight down the road at maximum speed. The idea was to blast through before the Germans could concentrate their fire, accepting casualties in exchange for momentum. It was a calculated risk that bordered on recklessness, but Abrams had learned from Patton. Sometimes audacity wins when caution fails. At 100 p.m. on December 24th, Combat Command A roared down the road toward Schomen. German anti-tank guns opened fire immediately. The lead Sherman was hit and knocked out within seconds. The 2nd tank swerved around it and kept going. The 3rd tank was hit but kept moving, trailing smoke. The column didn't stop. Abrams' tank was the 4th in line. He stood in the turret, directing fire as shells impacted all around. His gunner engaged German positions while the tank rolled forward at 15 MPS. It was mechanized cavalry charge, and it shouldn't have worked. But it did. The speed and violence of the attack overwhelmed the German defenders. American tanks crashed through the village, firing on the move. Infantry followed in half tracks, dismounting to clear buildings. Within 2 hours, Schomen was in American hands. The cost was steep. Combat Command lost 8 tanks and 53 men killed or wounded, but they'd broken through the last major defensive line before Bastonia. Only 7 mi remained. That Christmas Eve, as fighting raged in the Belgian countryside, something remarkable happened at churches and command posts throughout the region. Soldiers on both sides paused briefly to acknowledge the holiday. In Bastonia, paratroopers attended midnight mass in a bombed-out church. In German positions, soldiers sang Stilt, Silent Night. At Patton's headquarters, the general attended chapel services, then went immediately back to work. Patton wrote in his diary that night, "A clear, cold Christmas Eve, lovely weather for killing Germans." He'd received word that Abrams had broken through at Schomen. The road to Baston was open, or nearly open, but German forces were converging to close it. The 1st SS Panzer Division was moving units to block the corridor. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division was preparing a counterattack. If Patton's forces didn't punch through immediately, the window would close. At midnight, as Christmas Eve became Christmas Day, Patton sent a message to all his commanders. "We attack at dawn. No excuses, no delays. We reach Bastonia tomorrow or we die trying." December 25, 1944 was the coldest Christmas Day in Belgian history. Temperatures dropped to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice covered the roads. Fog rolled in, reducing visibility to 100 yards, and the 4th Armored Division attacked. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams led his battalion out at 6:30 a.m. before dawn. They rolled through the villages of Rhemish-Champagne and Cloquemot against sporadic resistance. German forces, exhausted and low on ammunition, were beginning to crack. Some units fought fanatically, others surrendered. Many simply retreated, unwilling to die in a battle they knew was lost. At 2 p.m., Abrams' lead tanks crested a ridge and saw in the valley below the town of Bastonia. American paratroopers held the perimeter, their positions marked by smoke from artillery fire. Between Abrams and Bastonia lay the village of Eisenhower and about 500 German soldiers. Abrams didn't hesitate. He formed his tanks into a wedge formation, 5 Shermans abreast, and attacked straight down the road. It was another all-or-nothing assault, the kind that military theorists would say was suicide, but that Patton had taught his officers to execute. The Germans in Eisenhower fought back desperately. Panzerfausts, German anti-tank rockets, streaked from buildings. Machine guns raked the American tanks. 2 Shermans were knocked out. 3 more were hit but kept moving. Abrams' tank led the charge. His gunner fired the 75mm main gun while the bow machine gunner sprayed buildings with .30 caliber fire. The tank crashed through a roadblock, scattering debris and burst through the village. At 4:45 p.m. on Christmas Day, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' lead tank made contact with the 101st Airborne's forward positions. The siege of Bastonia was broken. First Lieutenant Charles Basis, commanding the lead tank of C Company, 37th Tank Battalion, was the first man from 3rd Army to shake hands with paratroopers from the 1 or 1st. According to witnesses, Lieutenant Bogus simply said, "We're from the 4th Armored. Patton sent us." The link-up at Bastonia was a tactical success, but it wasn't the end. The corridor Patton's forces had opened was narrow, only a few hundred yards wide in places, and the Germans immediately tried to cut it. Over the next several days, fierce fighting raged as 3rd Army widened the corridor and pushed the Germans back. But the strategic reality had shifted. Hitler's last great offensive in the West had failed. The Germans had suffered approximately 100,000 casualties, lost 600 tanks and assault guns, and expended fuel and ammunition reserves they couldn't replace. The initiative had passed permanently to the Allies. Patton's 3rd Army had suffered heavy losses too, 15,000 casualties in 10 days of continuous combat. The 4th Armored Division alone lost over 1,000 men. But they'd accomplished what military professionals had said was impossible. On December 26th, Eisenhower sent Patton a message. "The outstanding accomplishment of your 3rd Army in its rapid movement to Bastonia and the breakthrough to the besieged garrison is a magnificent feat of arms." Odd. But the more revealing communication came in a private phone call between the two men. According to Eisenhower's naval aide, Harry Butcher, who was present when Eisenhower made the call, the Supreme Commander said simply, "George, you son of a, you actually did it." Patton's response, according to Butcher, "I told you I would, Ike. Next time maybe you'll believe me from the start." It was vintage, Patton. Arrogant, cocky, impossible to deal with, and absolutely right. What Eisenhower understood, sitting in his headquarters as reports of the Bastonia relief came in, was that Patton had done more than rescue a surrounded garrison. He demonstrated something fundamental about warfare, that speed, audacity, and aggressive leadership could overcome numerical disadvantages and difficult terrain. German General de Pansup Heinrich Freyer von Lüttwitz, whose Excelfeather Panzerkorps faced Patton's attack, later said in post-war interrogations, "We knew the Americans had great material superiority. We knew they had air power, but we thought we had time to consolidate. We thought they would take weeks to organize a counterattack. Patton attacked in 3 days. It was the fastest movement of that scale I saw in the entire warfield, Marshal." Gerd von Rundstedt, the German commander in the was even more blunt in his assessment. In interrogations after the war, he stated, "Patton's relief of Bastonia was the most brilliant operation of the war. The movement of 3 full divisions over that distance in that time in winter conditions against our forces, it was unmatched." Even Montgomery, who rarely praised American commanders, admitted in his memoirs, the speed of Patton's movements was remarkable. But perhaps the most telling assessment came from the soldiers who fought in that operation. Captain William Dwight, a company commander in the 4th Armored Division, wrote home on January 2, 1945. "We did something that we didn't think could be done. We moved faster and fought harder than we knew we could. Why? Because Patton said we would. And with Patton, you don't question. You just do it." In the weeks following the Bastonia relief, as the Battle of the Bulge ground toward its conclusion, the relationship between Eisenhower and Patton took on new dimensions. The Supreme Commander had always recognized Patton's combat effectiveness. But this operation revealed something deeper. Patton understood time in a way few commanders did. He understood that in war, speed creates opportunities, hesitation creates disasters, and audacity, properly calculated, can achieve what caution never will. Eisenhower's willingness to trust Patton's audacious promise to attack with 3 days' notice to move an entire Army Corps 75 miles through winter weather to sustain offensive operations in the worst conditions imaginable demonstrated his own growth as a Supreme Commander. He'd learned to use his most difficult subordinates' greatest strengths at the moment they were most needed. The irony wasn't lost on either man. Eisenhower, the careful planner, the coalition manager, the political general. Patton, the hell-for-leather warrior, impatient with politics, disdainful of caution. They were opposites in temperament, and they'd clashed repeatedly throughout the war. Yet, they formed one of the most effective command partnerships in military history. After the war, Eisenhower wrote in Crusade in Europe, George Patton was the most brilliant commander of an army in the open field that hour or any other service produced. He had the warrior's soul. The joy of battle was a real thing to him, and he transmitted his spirit to his troops. But Eisenhower also noted he required supervision and restraint. His dynamism was both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. Managing Patton was like riding a high-spirited horse. You had to keep control of the reins while giving him his head to run. Patton, for his part, wrote in his diary on New Year's Eve 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge wound down, "Ike let me attack when everyone else said it was impossible. He trusted me when caution said to wait. That's what separates him from the others. He understands that sometimes you have to risk everything on one bold throw." The relief of Bastonia also cemented Patton's reputation among the soldiers who served under him. The men of Third Army would go on to fight through the Siegfried Line across the Rhine into the heart of Germany. They would liberate concentration camps, capture hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, and race through Bavaria to Austria. But many of them later said that those 10 days in December 1944 were when they truly understood what it meant to serve under George S. Patton. Sergeant Bernard Rian, who fought with the 26th Infantry Division during the drive to Bastonia, wrote in his memoir published in 1982, "We called it Patton's Ghost Army because we moved so fast the Germans didn't know where we'd appear next. But it wasn't magic. It was Patton driving us harder than we thought we could be driven, asking more than we thought we could give, and somehow we gave it." The soldiers respected Patton because he delivered on his promises. He said he'd reach Bastonia, and he did. He said he'd keep them supplied, and he did. Third Army supply officers performed miracles of improvisation to keep ammunition and fuel flowing over icy roads. He said he'd break the German offensive, and he did. But they also respected him because he put himself at risk alongside them. Throughout the drive to Bastonia, Patton was constantly at the front, often well forward of where a three-star general had any business being. He visited battalions in contact with the enemy. He personally directed traffic at bottlenecks. He exposed himself to German artillery fire with a casualness that terrified his staff officers. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Harkins, Patton's deputy chief of staff, later wrote, "The general believed that a commander's place was forward, where he could see the situation with his own eyes and make decisions without delays. He took risks that made the rest of us nervous, but the men loved him for it. They knew he'd never ask them to do something he wouldn't do himself." As we reflect on what happened in those desperate December days, several historical lessons emerge. The relief of Bastogne wasn't just about military tactics or operational planning. It was about leadership, trust, and the willingness to attempt what conventional wisdom said was impossible. Eisenhower's decision to trust Patton's promise revealed something essential about command at the highest levels. Sometimes you have to bet everything on the ability of your subordinates to achieve what the staff officers say can't be done. Eisenhower had the intelligence reports, the logistics assessments, the weather forecasts, all suggesting that Patton's timeline was unrealistic. But he also had his knowledge of Patton's character, his track record, his obsessive drive to exceed expectations. That judgment call to say yes when the prudent answer was maybe change the course of the Battle of the Bulge and possibly the war. If Eisenhower had insisted on a more cautious timetable, Bastonia might have fallen. The German offensive might have gained momentum. The Allies might have been forced into a winter stalemate. Military historian Martin Blumenson, who wrote extensively about Patton, later noted, "Eisenhower's greatest talent was knowing when to unleash Patton and when to restrain him. At Bastonia, he unleashed him at exactly the right moment." But the story also reveals something about Patton that's often lost in the mythology surrounding him. Yes, he was audacious. Yes, he was aggressive to the point of recklessness. But he was also a meticulous planner who understood logistics, supply, and operational timing. His ability to promise a 3-day timeline wasn't based on bluster. It was based on contingency plans his staff had been working on since December 16th. Patton's genius lay in anticipation. While other commanders were reacting to the German offensive, Patton was already planning how to counter it. While others were trying to understand what had happened, Patton was 3 steps ahead, thinking about what would happen next. General Omar Bradley, who commanded the 12th Army Group and was Patton's immediate superior, wrote after the war, "George Patton could see 3 moves ahead like a chess grandmaster. The rest of us were playing checkers while he was playing chess. That's why he could make promises that sounded insane, because he'd already thought through all the steps necessary to make them happen." The aftermath of the Bastonia relief saw Patton's Third Army continue offensive operations throughout January and February 1945. They cleared the Bulge entirely, pushing the Germans back to their start lines and beyond. They breached the Seefried Line, they liberated Trier, they crossed the Rhine. But Patton never forgot those days in December. In a letter to his wife Beatrice written on January 10, 1945, he reflected on the operation. "We did something that will be talked about for a long time. We moved an army faster and farther than anyone thought possible. We saved Bastonia. We broke Hitler's last offensive. But what I'm most proud of is that our soldiers, American boys who everyone said were too soft, too unmilitary, too undisciplined, proved they could outmarch, outfight, and outlast the Germans. That's the real victory." The soldiers of the 101st Airborne, who endured the siege and then fought alongside Third Army to widen the corridor, developed a complex relationship with Patton. They were proud of having held Bastonia without relief. General McAuliffe famously said later, "We were surrounded. Now the Germans are surrounded." But they also recognized that without Patton's rapid relief, their situation would have become untenable. Major Richard Winters, whose exploits at Bastonia would later be immortalized in the book and miniseries Band of Brothers, wrote in his memoir, "We didn't need rescuing. We could have held out, but we sure as hell needed ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements. Patton got them to us." The rivalry between the 101st and 3rd Army was friendly, but we all knew if Patton hadn't moved as fast as he did, a lot more of us would have died in that frozen hell. In the decades since, military historians have analyzed the relief of Bastonia from every angle. Staff colleges around the world teach it as a case study in rapid deployment, operational tempo, and aggressive leadership. The operation has been dissected for its logistical achievements, its tactical innovations, and its strategic impact. But perhaps the most important lesson is one that can't be easily quantified: the power of leadership to inspire ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things. Patton soldiers didn't move 75 mi in 3 days, attack through blizzards, and break through veteran German units because they had superior equipment or better training. They did it because their commander said they would, and they believed him. That belief, that confidence in leadership, is what transforms a collection of individuals into an army. It's what allows soldiers to attempt missions that seem impossible. It's what makes the difference between defeat and victory. Dr. Carlo D'Aste, one of Patton's biographers, wrote in Patton, "A Genius for War." Patton's relief of Bastonia stands as one of the great feats of generalship in World War II. But more than that, it stands as proof that leadership matters, that personality matters, that will and determination can overcome material obstacles. In an age of statistics and technology, Patton reminded us that war is still fundamentally a human endeavor. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, looking back on the war from the perspective of the 1960s, said in an interview, "If I had to choose one operation that best demonstrated the American soldier's ability to accomplish the impossible, it would be Patton's relief of Bastonia. Not the largest operation, not the most complex, but the one that showed what Americans can do when they're properly led and properly motivated." Sight. And what of that moment when Patton walked unannounced into Eisenhower's conference room on December 19, 1944? That moment when the Supreme Commander looked up from his maps and said, "God, this is Patton." It was a moment that captured everything about their relationship. Eisenhower's exasperation with Patton's disregard for protocol, his relief that the one commander who might pull off a miracle had arrived, and his recognition that sometimes you need someone who doesn't know when to quit. History is full of turning points where everything hung in the balance. The relief of Bastonia was one of those moments. If you want to discover more stories of decisive leadership and impossible victories, subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's greatest moments. Like this video if you enjoyed it, and share it with anyone who loves military history. And here's something to think about. Eisenhower could have played it safe, could have waited for perfect conditions, could have listened to all the voices saying Patton's plan was too risky, but he didn't. He trusted audacity over caution. Remember that the next time someone tells you something can't be done, sometimes the impossible is just something nobody's tried yet. Until next time, keep exploring history. The story of Patton's unannounced arrival at Eisenhower's headquarters and his subsequent relief reminds us that great achievements often begin with someone willing to make an audacious promise. Patton promised he'd attack in 3 days. He promised he'd reach Bastonia. He promised he'd break the German offensive. And despite weather, terrain, logistics, and enemy resistance all arguing against him, he kept every promise. That's what made him both infuriating and indispensable. That's why Eisenhower, despite all the headaches Patton caused, kept bringing him back for the crucial battles. And that's why 75 years later, we still study what happened in those 10 days of December 1944 when one general said he'd do the impossible. Another general trusted him enough to let him try, and an entire army proved that sometimes belief and determination can overcome any obstacle.